Regulatory Affairs from Viridor. You're very welcome. Thank you for coming. We've also got Shlomo Dowen, who's here who's the National Coordinator of the UK Without Incineration Network. Thank you also for being here. Andy Richmond, who is here very frequently from the GLA. Thank you very much for coming again, Andy. It's very helpful. Tim Rotheray, who is the Director for the Association of Decentralised Energy. Thank you for coming, Tim. We have Professor Darryl Newport, who in his day job is to be found at the University of East London, but he's also associated with the Institute for Civil Engineers, and so is partially representing ICE as well as UCL. I hope I've got that balanced correctly there. And last, but hopefully very much not least, we are also joined by Julian Walker, who is the Chief Operating Officer from Cory Riverside Energy. Thank you very much to all of you for coming. So we're going to move into our questions on this area, and we're going to start with me putting some questions, and then the rest of the committee will come in as well. And so the first question that I'd like to start by putting to Andy, and then I'll open that up to general debate, is why do you think that there's been an increase in burning waste for energy in London? And I'm going to try and focus the discussion, I hope, into London.
Okay, certainly. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me again. I mean, predominantly, the majority of the increase that we've been experiencing in London has been down to the London Plan policies to manage more of London's waste within London. Since the London Plan was first written, there has been a 100% net self-sufficiency policy within that plan, and the purpose of that was for London to recognise the economic opportunity that resources presents it, but also to address a number of the issues that the then regions had for London sending waste out to landfill outside of London, and then subsequently the counties. This has been a continued challenge to London from the regions and the counties that they're not prepared, and they haven't got the land and the capacity to continue to manage London's growing waste stream. So waste for the last kind of 15 years, London's waste more of it has been managed within London.
So that was a sort of follow-up that I just wanted to ask you when you were saying the London Plan. It was the initial iteration under the first mayor that we're talking about that first brought forward the concept of self-sufficiency, if you like, in terms of dealing with our own waste.
That's correct, yes. Right. And then that's maintained throughout the iterations of the London Plan for that time period. At the same time, we've obviously put in high recycling targets within the first strategy, followed through within the second municipal waste management strategy of the mayors and the London Plan, which has gradually seen recycling increase over that period, and certainly until 2011 we saw a reasonable rate of increase in recycling within London. But that also
below everywhere else in the country.
Everywhere else in the country, and there are reasons for that. So I think, well, that's
but to our shame, I think that we are still behind.
There is a lot more we can do. It's not a level playing field, but there is a lot more we can do. But over that period of time, also with the landfill directive. And landfill tax escalators increasing, there was also, local authorities were also looking for an opportunity to move waste away from landfill, whether that was inside London or outside of London, to alternatives. That has seen an increase in the number of energy from waste plants that have been proposed and been through planning within London, and I think that's predominantly the majority of the reason why we've seen that increase over that period of time.
So in terms of the current mayor, having gone back through why we've got to where we are now, how would you characterise his position in terms of current and future use of energy from waste? Is that something that he wants to see a massive increase in, or steady state, or where are we?
So the modelling that we undertook for the environment strategy, this is the first time, I'll probably just remind the committee, this is the first time we've looked at municipal waste as being household waste and waste similar to household waste that is arising from commercial and other organisations as one single amount, a quantity of material in which we have to manage. And that's 7 million tonnes. We have now set, the Mayor has now set a 65% recycling target for that waste stream by 2030, but that still leaves approximately 2 million tonnes of waste that would not be recycled and would therefore need to have some further treatment. In terms of the existing and planned facilities, when I say planned facilities, we're including the Beddington facility, which is actually in construction, and the replacement Edmonton facility. Once those two facilities are online, we would have approximately 2,100,000 tonnes of capacity within London, which we believe is sufficient to manage the material that would not be recycled. Notwithstanding, there'll be some material that would not be appropriate for that energy recovery facility, but if you kind of take a binary view in terms of, we're talking about massive numbers, 65% recycling would leave there'll be sufficient capacity to manage the non-recyclable waste.
It actually sounds like a bit of overcapacity in there. Is that because you're expecting the trajectory towards the 65% to be particularly slow? No. I mean, the capacity, the London plan and the environment strategy does not plan for any additional capacity. So this is capacity that's already in the pipeline. Yes, but what I'm saying is I mean, obviously, I think Beddington, which I visited as part of my preparation for this waste investigation, is going to be coming on stream in 2018. Yes. I'm not quite so sure of the actual arrangements in terms of the enlargement improvement at Edmonton, but that's going to be fairly soon. What I'm wondering is how soon will we be heading towards the 65% recycling, which is a goal in 2030.
Yes. And
in the meantime, it sounds as though we, by the time we get to the 65%, it will be over capacity. So you're saying there'll only be 2 million tonnes that need a different mechanism other than being recycled. So the 2.4 will be over capacity by then, but in the meantime, it will be about the right capacity, you think?
Yeah, so by the time we get to 2030, if we achieve the 65%, and just assuming a small growth in waste arisings over that time period, factored in with from population growth and economic growth. We've not factored it, well, that does not necessarily factor in the opportunities that could present us around circular economy and further reduction in materials. So certainly I think we are projecting that there is there will be by far enough capacity within London to deal with the non-recyclable waste.
Okay, so no further plans for any further incinerators or energy from waste plants other than those ones that we've got that are working now and the two that are either expanding or being constructed. What can the Mayor do? How can he influence how much waste is being burnt across London to make sure that we head towards that 65% as quickly as possible?
So in terms of London plan policy, we've put in place policies that would require that any waste going to energy from waste would need to meet the carbon intensity floor. So that means that predominantly non-recyclable waste, but also the provision of district heating networks, so very efficient plants, much more efficient than is required through the national incineration directives. But also the approach that we're taking from now on, now we're looking at the municipal waste in its entirety, is to work much closer with the waste collection operators operating in London to see how we can work together to maximise the amount of commercial waste that's also been collected for recycling and offset the need for energy from waste provision from the recyclable waste from the commercial waste sector.
Can I just see if there's anyone else who wants to come in at this point? No, I'm talking about the guests, Nikki, not at this point. Is it? So, Shlomo.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's very clear to me, looking at the latest statistics, that recycling is not keeping up with incineration in London. The gap now between recycling and incineration in relation to local authority collected waste is 23.5 percentage points. That is, there is 23.5%, something in the region of 53.5% of LACW that goes to incineration, and only about 30% that is recycled. So it's clear to me that what this signifies is that recyclable and compostable material is being used as feedstock for incinerators. And obviously, one way to create much more capacity for EFW in London is to limit what goes into incinerators to only genuinely residual waste, and then suddenly you'll have twice as much capacity.
Well, that's exactly why we're talking about this today.
Exactly, yes.
To try and tease out exactly what is going in and what should be going in, and to make sure, but that's why we also started at the top of the waste hierarchy with circular economy, to try and make sure that we examine all elements of the chain from the minute when waste leaves somebody's hand through to where it ends up at the end of that, and hopefully not a linear route. I'm just going to take Julian and then I'll bring in Dan. Julian, I saw you first.
Yes, no, thank you very much. As you may have seen, Cory submitted a planning application through the PINS process for expanding our plant down at Belvedere. The justification behind this process is we've done a lot of research and used a number of independent consultants to gauge where the market will be in the future. We clearly are very supportive of recycling. We do a lot of recycling up in Smugglers. We do 75,000 tonnes per annum for them. But the assessment that we've done with independent consultants is that if the 65% is not achieved by 2030, there will be a capacity gap taking into account the existing facilities and those that we've built of between 600 and 1.4 million. So my point is, I think it is very important that we understand that we should be readily set up to deal with the opportunity or deal with the possibility that the 65% won't be achieved. What I would also like to just touch on, in respect of the comment that EFW artificially suppresses recycling, we fundamentally disagree with that. I think it is clear. Bexley is our home borough, and that borough has the highest recycling in London. It's in excess of 54%. In all of our LACW contracts, there are no minimum volume guarantees, and also the recycling rate or tariff, gate fee, is materially cheaper than the residual waste. So it's actually in the to the benefit of the LACW to do more recycling. The final point is that important to remember as well that our new development will have CHP.
I'm going to slightly stop you on the new development because we're actually going to come back to some questions about the future capacity, which Nikki is going to lead on towards the end of our set of questions. Dan, did you want to come in on the sort of current issues? And
so in answer to your original question and some of the points that have come up, it is important to note that companies like ours operating in the sector do provide recycling-led services to businesses as well as to local authorities. And what we have to, the moves that we've seen towards higher recycling rates and recovery rates working in a complementary fashion is driven by a good combination of the London plan that we've heard about and an ambitious environment strategy which sets a great framework. But also the economics and the policy effects at a UK level. So economics, we have the landfill tax, the driver away from landfill, and we all applaud that. We're all working very hard to deliver that, those recycling-led services. But we have to, as the point's just been made, provide good value for money services that is to the maximum benefit of the London economy. And that's why the balance between more recycling wherever that can be delivered in an economic way for our business and local authority partners, with recovery in a complementary, and finding the right levels that we can. And 65%, 35% will be great if we can get there, but remember, we have to make sure there aren't huge volumes of material left sloshing around the London economy if we don't get there. So I think it's a good combination. There is a really good opportunity here for the contribution of energy recovery in London to make towards energy security and the utilisation of heat and plugging into heat networks to make them more efficient as we get them up and running and operating. And again, important to reflect, the commercial and industrial collection services and recycling services we provide will contribute to the recycling performance of London going forward, and we are working hard to make sure we can deliver more recycling capacity at the same time as delivering the energy recovery capacity we're building.
Okay, I think at this point I'm going to move on to Caroline, who's going to ask some questions about the environmental impacts of energy from waste, because I think, Nikki, we're going to come back to you in terms of the capacity issue, which is when you put your hand up, and we're going to talk about future capacity, and you're going to ask a series of questions about that.
I just wondered if I could ask about beyond 2030, because the Mayor has...
Well, that's the future, so I think we'll come back to that later.
Oh okay.
Your questions are about future capacity, so if you're going to go beyond 2030, that's definitely classes as in the future.
It's just that the recycling targets beyond 2030 aren't laid out beyond 65%, and I just wondered whether...
I think we'll come back to that when we come on
okay.
to the future area, and perhaps Andy could flag that as something that he might comment on beyond 2030 recycling targets when we come to the future. So if we move on to environmental impacts, and I'd like to bring in Caroline at this point, who is going to ask these questions.
Thank you, Chair. So, yes, looking at the environmental impact of energy from waste, and obviously noting that energy from waste is second from bottom in terms of the hierarchy, if we're thinking about the environmental impacts of dealing with waste. My first question, and I'll put this both to Darryl Newport and also to Dan Cooke, is just broadly, what are the environmental impacts of burning waste for energy? Darryl, do you want to start?
I wonder if I could help out on this. I'm not sure if my knowledge is that great, but I'll see what I can do. But in terms of the environmental issues from energy from waste, most of the local issues, air pollution issues, are actually dealt with a number of scrubbing solutions. So actually, it has been found that actually particulate matter around facilities is actually very good. The major problem from energy from waste facilities is actually the scrubber that comes from that the stack system, which APCR is air pollution control residue. So that's where most of your issues come from. Most of the actual the gaseous material that comes out of the stack from the system is carbon dioxide. But actually, in terms of, and I might have to check with my colleagues here, in terms of the amounts that are actually coming out through the stack and the amounts that would actually come out from landfill, including methane dioxide, there's a net negative gain to that. So it's a good situation to be in, but only just. But in terms of actually then what you do with the material that comes out of the stack, that's the interesting thing. And if you're looking at 2 million tonnes of material going in, and at least 3.5 to 4% of that is APCR.
Speak up, Darryl.
Oh, sorry. If you look at the sort of the 7 million tonnes of waste, and then obviously 2 million tonnes going to energy from waste, the 3.5% of that type of material would come back out as APCR, 4%. You're still looking at 300 to 400,000 tonnes of APCR waste that you have to currently put to landfill, and it's specialist landfill.
Sorry, this APCR.
You just say these figures again.
And sorry, could you say again what APCR is again?
PCR is air pollution control residue.
Okay, so that's...
Which is the material that they put into the stack.
In the air.
Well, no. That's what they put. It comes out of the stack where they're putting the gases through to clean the gases going through. So it actually is very clean. The gas that comes out is very clean, but it's the APCR that then they take out, which holds most of the... I can see
Julian is very keen to contribute on...
No, I just wanted to...
And you were suggesting either Julian or perhaps Dan might
I just wanted to make it clear, it doesn't come out through the stack. So the process, the cleaning process of the gases goes through a number of filtration bags. It has activated carbon added to it, which essentially captures the heavy metals and any nasties. So the fine material that's left, the APCR, either goes to landfill or gets treated by, there are two companies that we use which do a number of processes for recycling that material. So it is an area
what sort of processes for recycling it? I mean, does it go into roads?
It gets converted into breeze blocks, for example, and there are companies that do that. There have been problems with that in the past, and that's now been resolved. So it doesn't all go into landfill.
How much does go to landfill?
So out of our process, and I can only speak for ours, which is Belvedere, so we treat 750,000 tonnes of London's waste. There's about 10,000 tonnes of APCR, of which 50% goes to landfill. And that...
10,000 tonnes?
10,000, no, and 50% of that, so 5,000 tonnes. That is actually a legacy issue because of the contract that we had to put in place as part of the planning process. So we would prefer not to do that, but we have a contract that we are obliged to stick to, and we've tested it legally to see if we could extricate ourselves from that, and we can't. So the world has moved on considerably since we received our planning process, and are now effective ways for doing it without sending it to landfill.
What proportion, what proportion is ash before you do all your things?
So ash, out of the 750,000 tonnes of waste that we treat, we produce about 200,000 tonnes of IBA, incinerated bottom ash. That bottom ash, and I need to be clear on this, about 20,000 tonnes of that is metal, and that is all recycled. The remainder is then used in the aggregates and the construction market, thereby displacing 180,000 tonnes of quarry material that would need to be quarried in the UK. So it's actually reusing or recycling or upcycling, however you want to look at it, the actual ash that comes out.
Can I'll bring Dan back in now, because I think that's what you wanted, Dan, didn't you, to come in? Yeah.
Hey, so in terms of back to the original question, I would say don't underestimate the big step up the waste hierarchy that the move from landfill for these hundreds of thousands of tonnes, indeed millions of tonnes of material across the UK into energy recovery represents. And that is a major environmental benefit in terms of overall carbon impact. It reduces the methane emissions that we're working hard to get away from landfilling that material and losing it in terms of the economic benefit, the energy security that it can supply. However, many people look at energy from waste in its current technologies as part of the transition to a lower carbon technology. It should also be recognised that about 64%, as far as I recall the latest government figures being, of inputs into energy from waste is deemed as renewable material. It is biogenic material. The remainder of that is the fossil fuel material, which is the carbon that we have to work hard to move away from. I know we'll come back to futures, but as lots of drivers in the world of plastics, for example, move to produce more packaging from biopolymers, organic made plastics and materials, that renewable input into the energy recovery infrastructure that we're delivering in London may well improve, and therefore these become more reliant on renewable fuels, good renewable fuels, and generate good renewable energy. In terms of environmental impact, we also have to remember that all of the facilities, and we operate a fleet of 8 energy recovery facilities across the UK at the moment, including Lakeside out near Heathrow. Beddington is one of 4 that we're building and will bring online. They all operate under very effective regulations, standards and controls. And indeed, the compliance records of the plants, the modern generation of energy recovery plants is impeccable. So the high standards that have come down from Europe, that have been implemented by UK government and within London, are extremely effective in making sure that the emissions, that some of the emissions we've talked about and the emission standards are very rigorous and very robust. In terms of last point I'd make in terms of the outputs, I would reiterate what we've already heard. So the air pollution control systems that are within the plant, and we inject ammonia into the combustion chamber to prevent the formation of oxides of nitrogen, potential air quality issues. We introduce activated lime, activated carbon to remove any other emissions. And those, the lime and the carbon is caught in very effective filters. And those filters are knocked off, and that's what forms the air pollution control residue. We have contracts in place at all of our plants at the moment to make sure that all of that material will eventually be recycled. And the recycling capacity for that material in the UK is coming up to meet the capacity that we've built in terms of overall energy recovery. And it is turned into, effectively neutralised and turned into a perfectly serviceable and good quality product that can be used in the construction industry. And that's not just filler, that's freeze blocks for construction.
Okay, what about greenhouse gas emissions from burning all of this material?
So quickly and without any figures in front of me, that's where we come to the transition technology that energy from waste represents. The main emissions that you see from a stack in any of the plants that operate both in London and the rest of the UK are carbon dioxide and water, with very small levels of some of the trace compounds. Carbon dioxide is the material we have to move away from. Much of that comes from burning some of the low-grade plastics, the non-recyclable material that goes into those plants. However, it is still a marked improvement on putting that material into landfill and the methane that would result as that. So it is that big step up the hierarchy, and we're looking in terms of plant efficiency, and if the more heat utilisation we can deliver, for example, the more efficient these plants become, and therefore the carbon intensity of the plants will further reduce over time as we deliver them and then optimise.
Do you think there's a risk, though, that if there's lots of incineration capacity, that local authorities are less inclined to make the effort to recycle and reuse materials before, you know, I mean, incineration should be the very last ditch thing. And the way that the incineration plants are being talked about is, you know, it sort of makes it sound quite easy to use them. And do you not think that there's a risk that actually our recycling efforts are going to, you know, that people will just think, oh, it doesn't really matter, we'll just burn it?
I don't think so. I think the tide of, towards recycling will continue. The demand we're seeing from customers, both local authority, from businesses, and certainly from households, and we've done household recycling index surveys to ask people what they think good levels of recycling are, what they think about their recycling services, and time again, year in, year out, that demand for good quality, convenient, easy to use, and cost-effective recycling services continues to grow. So I don't think we can turn back that tide, and I'm very pleased about that. As a recycling company and one of the biggest in the UK, we're very pleased about that. But it is a challenge. And we know in London we have lower than average recycling levels achieved by local authorities. So this is where it's a mix of that economics and the very good and pragmatic targets set within the London environment strategy and UK-wide recycling targets that will continue to drive that to achieve that balance between higher levels of recycling that we got at the moment and complementary levels of recovery that we need to see.
Thank you. I've got Tim. Sorry, Nikki. Tim's just indicating.
I think that your question about if we have a lot of incineration facilities, does that mean that we won't bother recycling? There's some quite helpful evidence that you can see particularly in Denmark and Sweden, where heat networks.
I don't want to have to ask to clear the public gallery, but could I ask that people don't comment from the public gallery? This is a meeting where Assembly members are questioning our guests. I did earlier on give you the information about how you can join in terms of comments on Twitter, which will then be very public to the rest of the world who aren't here. But it's really difficult for us if you talk over the guests because we actually can't hear what they're saying. Thank you. Would you like to continue, Tim?
Thank you. So in Denmark, they have a commitment to make all of their energy fossil-free, and they already have a significant amount of energy recovery on their heat networks. And Denmark is about 60% of homes and businesses on heat networks. They recover the power and the heat from their energy recovery facilities. And when I visited about 3 years ago, they were talking around about 65 to 75% biogenic materials, so food waste and other residues being combusted in those plants. And their intention is to deliver, or their plan, and they're on track for it, to deliver carbon-free energy. So they are managing to pull more and more of the fossil-derived plastics out of their waste streams and recycling more. And they tend to have higher recycling rates than we do, and yet they've actually got these facilities at the heart of their cities. So it absolutely needs strong policies, and it needs clear direction from national and from local government, but it is not necessary that the existence of waste recovery facilities stops recycling. In fact, the opposite has been seen to be the case in those countries.
Thank you. Shlomo, you...
Okay, yes, a few quick points. First of all, it's a bit confusing because energy from waste covers a lot of technologies. We're actually talking about incineration. I know the industry doesn't like to use the I word, but let's differentiate from anaerobic digestion and other forms of energy from waste. We're talking about incineration. Not all incinerators are actually above landfill in the waste hierarchy. There is an R1 formula, and all incinerators that fall short of that threshold of 0.65, which isn't 65% thermal efficiency, but it is a calculation that means that incinerators, generally speaking, when we're talking about municipal waste incinerators, are by default disposal facilities at the same level in the waste hierarchy as landfill. The second point to make is that, as the Mayor's environmental strategy notes, half of all London's food waste is going for incineration. Well, in terms of environmental impacts, which was your question, that's absolutely outrageous. You heard a month ago that there's anaerobic digestion plants with capacity going spare. Clearly, that food waste should not be
Clearly, we were in that meeting. So
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So you know. So when it comes to environmental impact, part of the environmental impact is that incinerators are robbing composting and anaerobic digestion of their feedstock, which brings us on to the health arguments very briefly. Incinerators damage air quality and damage soil quality, and they cause nuisance to the neighbours, so there are adverse environmental impacts there. And then finally, in relation to climate change, I note, having looked at Cory's carbon report, that when you look at it more closely, it actually demonstrates that sending waste to Cory's Riverside incinerator results over a 30-year period in between 6.7 and 10.5 million tonnes more CO2 emitted than sending that same waste untreated to landfill. Obviously, if you compare it with recycling, then the CO2 emissions from the Riverside incinerator are even worse. But even if we just take a straight comparison between sending the waste untreated to landfill, even though there are many ways to pre-treat it to reduce the climate change impact, the Cory Riverside incinerator is a climate sinner rather than a climate saint.
Okay, thank you. One other environmental impact is obviously the road transport to actually get the materials to the incinerator plants. Does anyone want to comment on that? Yes, Dan.
I guess at a high level, having self-sufficiency within London at the moment, if the infrastructure that's under construction and that we've already talked about is delivered, combined with good recycling infrastructure within London as well, will actually have a benefit, because at the moment quite a lot of London's waste has to go outside the boundaries of London to find the diminishing landfills for disposal. And therefore, if you have self-sufficiency for London, you are treating the material or utilising the material as close to its point of arising as possible. So minimising transport emissions, optimising logistics around waste management. Transport and logistics is one of our main costs in the sector. Therefore, there is always a drive to drive efficiencies and make that as efficient an operation as possible. Having self-sufficiency and treating the waste as close to its point of arising has to be a benefit and has to be the right way forward in the right direction.
Thank you. Now, the environmental impact of waste to energy is going to depend on efficiency, the waste mix, the carbon intensity of other energy sources, and other factors that can change over time. So how can the Mayor and others anticipate these changes when they're planning the waste strategy, and how can operators be monitored and held accountable? Who would like to, Tim, you're indicating, so.
So you're absolutely right that there's the emissions associated with any plant burning any element of fossil fuels is going to become more significant as the rest of the power system decarbonises, and then the heat system as well, whatever that might be, electricity, gas or heat. The key thing from a long-term decarbonisation of the power system is to enable those energy from waste plant to operate flexibly. So if you have a day where there's lots of sun and lots of wind and they're dominating the power system and there's no fossil plant at all on that system, then you don't want plant to be producing electricity. If you have a period, at the same time when you have an evening and it's in winter and there's no solar and maybe it's not that windy, then actually those plant will be displacing higher carbon plant on the system. So the flexibility of those plant is key. One of the ways that you can do that, obviously a key driver in the carbon content is making maximum use of the energy, so recovering the heat. When you recover that heat, one of the key enablers of flexibility is by storing it, by making big heat stores. And we have in London several heat stores. The biggest one is probably 2,500 tonne heat store at Pimlico. Those heat stores enable generating plant to operate flexibly and generate their energy at times which disconnects the time of demand for energy on the network from the time at which it's generated. So that's probably one of the key ways, recovering the heat and then operating those plants flexibly, and that's a longer term driver.
So you're talking about storage?
Thermal storage, yeah.
Should we let Julian come in and then...
Sorry, just one very quick point, and I just want to come back on the point made there. The Carbon Trust, who are obviously independent, did a report on our facility, and their conclusion was that we save approximately 200 kilograms of CO2 compared to waste that's put into landfill. So I just want to make sure that's understood.
Just as a point of order...
Wait.
I'm sorry, we don't offer points of order.
Okay.
I'm chairing the meeting and I will bring you in. Yep. And I've now got 2 assembly members showing, as well as you showing, and I can just remind you that we have got a number of other areas to cover. So, and it really does not help if we keep interrupting each other. I'm going to come back to Julian, who was called in, and then I'm going to Sean, and then Nikki, and then I will bring you in, Shlomo.
Thank you. No, I was just going to make the point in terms of technology. Depending on the type of technology that's used in EFW, whether it's gasification pyrolysis or incineration, full incineration, one of the benefits of full combustion incineration is that it can handle a broad CV of waste. So our plant, which is the one I know, can handle waste between 7 and 13 CV. So that gives it resilience as we go forward, and the expectation is that CV will probably drop because obviously the reduced amount of plastics, which we will support. And therefore, in terms of technology, it's important that that's taken into account as to the right technology, having that resilience to handle a broad CV of waste.
Sean, you wanted to comment?
Just a quick question on flexibility, just address this to Tim. You talked about flexibility, but does that work from a business point of view and a rubbish point of view? Because it seems to me that if we went this route and we made incineration a big part of our rubbish collection disposal, it would very quickly overwhelm the flexibility that you're talking about. It doesn't seem realistic to me.
No, so there are plants out there which have the ability to take in waste and then operate their generation flexibly. But the point is that you're continuing to operate. If you have thermal store, you continue to operate the plant, and the energy is being put into the thermal store. So you're not stopping the operation of the plant. What you're doing is you're storing it, and so that if you have the customers that, for example, if you're generating during the day, the customers come home in the evening, they then turn their heating on, and that heat is then delivered to those customers. So the plant is still operating. You're not actually stopping the operating of the plant. You're enabling the flexibility of the energy use.
We're sort of poaching into Joanne's subsequent questions here, so I've allowed you, Sean, but I'm now going to cut that discussion short, and we will now come back to that. Nikki.
Mine's on the proximity principle. My understanding is that Belvedere, Beddington Deby and Edmonton are all going to be taking a quite substantial amount of waste from a 50-mile radius, and that Belvedere and Beddington will take it from counties outside. Is this correct? What?
If I speak for Belvedere at the moment, as you probably see, we have barges going up and down the Thames collecting waste from the WRWA, where we have waste transfer stations, so that's Wandsworth and Battersea, and then we have a waste transfer station in Walbrook across here. So for our particular plant, 650 of the 750,000 tonnes come by road. Sorry, by the river. So
from London?
Yes, from the centre of London. We then have a waste transfer station in LBTH, so the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, and we receive by road from Bexley, because obviously it doesn't make sense to bring it by road.
And you don't bring in any commercial waste from outside London?
Outside the London area, no, we don't.
You bring no waste in from outside London?
Not at the moment, no, none at all.
In fact, don't we export waste out of London to the continent?
We send 600,000 tonnes of London's waste to the continent. And I think it's an important point to make. Of the 750,000 tonnes of waste we treat, we generate 528 gigawatt hours of power, which is enough power for...
How much?
528 gigawatts, or enough power for 160,000 homes. Yes, exactly.
What about heat?
Heat, we have the ability to export heat, so we're a full CHP plant, but we don't have the landside infrastructure, i.e. the piping going from the plant to...
So no heat?
Not
Thanks.
yet.
Can we just go on to
Nikki,
Beddington?
I
wanted to ask about Beddington and how much they were taking from outside London.
That would be Dan then, because Viridor is building the Beddington plant.
So happy to take that. At the moment, the plant's due to come online next year, so we're going into commissioning. Hopefully, first burn will be before the end of this year. Our market analysis shows that all of our inputs, the vast majority of the input, or the biggest proportion, will come from the South London Waste Partnership, which is
150,000 tonnes.
Yeah, which is 4 London local authorities working together. The rest of the material inputs for the fuel for the inputs will come from the local market. The South London market, remember, it's not just local authorities, it's business, commercial and industrial material we're helping to recover energy from as well. So it is the local market. The other thing to remember, and the assurance that you have on that, is remember Kent, Surrey, Sussex, the local authority areas surrounding that bit of South London all have their own facilities and are all building in their own capacity. So it's not likely, in fact it's highly unlikely, we'll be able to offer a service to local authorities locally. And remember the point I made about transport, one of the highest costs in waste management is transport, so the further away you bring material, the more expensive it becomes. So we are building a facility for the local market. The last thing I'd mention is likewise heat. We have already signed an agreement with Esten, the Sutton District heating network, to supply heat. We're about to plug in heat from the landfill gas.
How many megawatts?
Pardon?
How many megawatts?
Of heat, I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to come back to you on that.
Can you let us know?
To start with, it's a modest one because we've plugged in the landfill gas engines. As soon as we bring the energy recovery facility on, all of the heat output that we can supply, we will supply via that agreement.
Now we're going to move on to David's set of questions, Nikki, because you've now poached into another set of questions as well. So we're leaping around through our briefing, and other members may now not necessarily feel that they want to cover all their questions. We're going to come on to the public health impact of energy from waste, and David's going to ask some, Shlomo and Julian, and possibly others.
I think one of the guests has a hand up.
Sorry, I just wanted to...
Did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to clarify something on the last question, if I may. If we're sending RDF material to Europe, and we're talking about the fact that they're actually... is that because their recycling programs are much better now, and therefore the businesses who are producing energy are actually requiring to import material in order for them to stay viable?
They're importing.
Is that
And that's their problem, not ours, though, don't you?
No, I know, but I'm just wondering whether or not, if that's the case, in terms of capacity, if we're developing capacity, we don't want to overdevelop capacity if we then find ourselves importing material in order to keep...
No, absolutely. But that was why we were trying to explore that earlier on in the questions about do we have sufficient capacity, and with Andy and talking about potential growth of population and the need for the additional capacity to meet that. Now, you know, but at the moment we've also got stuff that we're exporting which perhaps we don't have sufficient capacity for. Now, whether that's going to create an overcapacity elsewhere in Europe, I'm afraid I'm going to concentrate on London today, not even the rest of the UK, and I'm certainly not taking on capacity issues or overcapacity in Denmark, the Netherlands or Germany. I think that's slightly beyond our remit. David, can I come back to you?
Yeah, of course, thank you. So I'd like to ask about the effects of incineration of burning waste on public health, and if I could start with you, Shlomo, and just ask you quite simply,